Okay, so one second. We're going to be talking about this grant that we got. The grant was put together really quickly. Some of you saw the initial announcement of it where we just asked for people who were generally interested. And then we're doing another call. But basically here, I want to talk about what the grant would require and how it's going to work as far as we know. And this is all something we can talk about now if you have some better suggestions.
Usually I can download the slides if I'm watching on Zoom. Will
Yes.
eventually be somehow be someplace.
Yes.
Or I can
Yes.
always check the South web page and.
It will be there in just a minute.
No,
Maybe, I think it's on the last slide, but you will be able to download the slides. Okay, so this we put together, and this is actually a slide deck created mostly by Gemini with some additions. I took the grant proposal and had to create this because I've got a lot of sessions going on this week, so I got a little bit lazy. But I did edit it to add some relevant information and reorganize it a bit. Okay, so the purpose of the project is, well, there was a call for SUNY OER and IITG grants, and we put in a proposal that combines both OER with AI. And the goal is to replace commercial textbooks, but also at the same time to help enhance AI literacy for faculty. Because one of the problems with OER is that many people are reluctant to adopt OER because it lacks all the ancillaries that publishers provide. So one of the goals is to use AI tools to generate something equivalent to the publisher ancillaries based on whatever you think is most appropriate for your course. And also, the main reason for this is that OER courses are free, or OER students don't have to pay for textbook. Every textbooks, they get access the first day, and they can download them and use them indefinitely. So there's a lot of good reasons for using OER. Now, anyone who participates in the grant will be getting in a Brightspace shell to develop that. And the goal, and part of the reasons why SUNY is funding this, is to help build up the availability of OER materials. So basically, you would create a course that meets all the accessibility requirements, which we have to do anyway, that could then be shared in an archive file that could be downloaded by other faculty at our institution or anyone else. So it'll be shared through some type of a website. You'd also be developing some ancillaries, which could be things for formative assessment. We'll go over the specific details of that later. There'll be at least one learning activity requiring students to critically reflect on how they're using AI and so forth, which is something we should probably be doing anyway. You could do that throughout the course, but there should be at least one where students are using AI in a manner that's critical and reflective. And anything that you'd be creating would be shareable under Creative Commons license for reuse across SUNY and, well, SUNY faculty and campuses. Okay, and if you have any questions, just open your mic. Yes.
How long is the time for this?
It'll be next year. So it'll be starting at the start of the fall semester and finishing up by the end of the spring semester. Okay. So
the course doesn't have to be ready until the following.
It wouldn't have to be ready until the following
fall of
2027. Yes. Right. Mm-hmm. I suppose you could try doing it on the fly in the spring semester, but that's a bit risky. So what we thought is to give people a choice of how they're going to integrate AI. And we came up with a list of 5 options. And the goal would be that each course would include at least 3 of these. One is a really simple one, just uploading some of the OER materials into Notebook.LM, have it generate audio podcasts to give some multimodal materials. And so you basically create the audio versions, you download them and embed them right in Brightspace. So that way it would be shareable, because it wouldn't be shareable if you share the notebook itself, because that's going to be restricted to people who have, well, for people that you agree to share it with, they have to be manually put in there. But the podcast can be exported and as an MP3 file. Another option is to create a Socratic tutorial chatbots as a Gemini gem. And these are really easy to do. It's about, you can do it, you can create it in about 3 or 4 minutes. You probably want to spend a few hours training it though and putting some guardrails in. But basically, it would be trained on the same materials as a course. Some people have done this where they have one for each course module, where students interact with that very narrow information that's available only within that course module, or it could be done for the whole course and accessible for students whenever they want to use it. Another option is to create low stakes formative assessments. Now that could be created in Gemini or Lumi if you choose to do that. That was left off, but you could use Lumi as well, which is the AI tool in Brightspace. Another option is to create interactive course materials, vibe coded in whatever platform you most prefer. And we'll have some workshops on that. I was at a vibe coding workshop at CIT just 2 weeks ago today, I think it was. And I was able to create an interactive demand and supply diagram with little sliders where students could change parameters, watch the curve shift, show how the equilibrium changed, and so forth. So, you could create any number of possible interactive course materials just with a prompt, basically, that would then be embedded in the course. And you could do that. I did it in Claude or Claude Code, but you could do it in pretty much all of them now.
I'm sorry, what is vibe?
Vibe coding is programs that are created by AI based on a prompt that you provide. So instead of doing the actual coding in JavaScript or in Python or whatever language you might choose to work in, it does all that for you. You store it typically in GitHub. You can create a free GitHub account, and basically you just embed that in the course. It's really easy to do. In a 3-hour workshop, I think I created 6 or 7 different vibe coded applications that work really nicely.
Yeah, you mentioned that for one of these, there will be workshops. Looks like some of my colleagues are like me. I don't know what Socratic tutor.
Oh, a Socratic tutor is one where it will ask students questions and guide them to an answer using the Socratic method.
So will there be some kind of workshop for this?
We did one last week, and I've done them, I think 5 or 6 times now, but for each of these things, we'll do some workshops in the late summer or the beginning of the semester.
Okay.
So, and it doesn't have to all be done at once.
Sure. Knowing all 5, the reason I'm interested because I don't know this language. So
No, a Socratic tutor is basically one where it won't directly answer students' questions, but it will guide them to an answer. And when they're wrong, it will ask other questions, often lower level questions, to help them see where they're going in the wrong direction and guide them to. Gemini doesn't work as well as ChatGPT or Claude and other, but we all have access to Gemini, which is why I listed it that way. They work best in ChatGPT right now, or Claude, but Claude has very limited free use. But it'd probably be better by the fall. The reason why I said it doesn't work quite as well in Gemini is it's fairly easy to break it and get it to give you direct responses. So part of the prompt that you're using, a gem is nothing more than a set of commands that are automatically implemented, sort of like a prompt that's shared with people and it's automated. And you can choose the materials trained on. So if you have OER materials for the course, you would restrict it to using the materials that you provide for the training. And so that way it will have very few, if any, hallucinations.
The reason you keep mentioning Gemini is because as SUNY Oswego you get free version of Gemini.
Yes.
And for ChatGPT, I have free version that has been working for me pretty well, and I do research with this.
I do most of my work in ChatGPT.
And if I use it like 5 hours in a row, at the end of 5 hours it says that your time has run out, start a new what is called conversation, or wait for 3 more hours. For me it works. Is that going to work same thing for my student, let's say?
It is, and that's one of the reasons why I listed Gemini, because what happens is if we did it with ChatGPT, I just ran a group with 18 faculty across SUNY on creating chatbots, and they all started with ChatGPT because a grant provided funding for that. But the problem was in Stony Brook, for example, they did not have ChatGPT licenses for students, so students were using the free one or the paid one if they were already paying for a free version. And what happened is the students who had the paid version ended up getting many more responses and were able to work with it more extensively, while the free version students would run out of tokens and would have to wait to come back later. So what they did there, because they do have Gemini, is they migrated their GPTs from ChatGPT to Gemini Gems, and that way all students had the same access, because very few students pay for the paid version, but they have the same sort of version that we do, basically, the educational version. And the nice thing about that is the information is not used for training purposes. And Gemini, I believe, still has the largest context window, the amount of memory that can be allocated to processing it of any of the platforms out there right now that are freely available.
But you also said it doesn't work as well as.
It doesn't work quite as well. It doesn't always stick to the guardrails,
Right.
but if you tighten the prompts a little bit and reiterate things in the prompt, it tends to get better.
Okay.
We ran into that a bit this time, and the more you train them, the better they get. But we have a podcast coming out in 4 weeks with someone who built his whole course around using Gemini Gems with this type of tutorial thing. And he noted that halfway through the semester, it broke down because it was just ignoring the guardrails, and he had to revise the prompts quite a bit so that it would not just give students answers to questions. And I see someone have their hand up. Preeti.
Yes. Hi, John. So you talked about the interactive course material,
Yes,
which is vibe coded in LLM platform of choice. So
yes.
what are these platforms of choice that you're talking
Oh,
about?
the
And
ones
secondly,
that people would be most likely to use would be Gemini, or Claude, or
I see. Okay.
ChatGPT, and if you already are using Claude or ChatGPT to do programming, you might be more comfortable doing it that way. If you are learning it from scratch, you'd probably want to do it right in Gemini, or Claude, because even the free version of Claude does pretty decent job of vibe coding. You wouldn't be able to create too many applications at once, but if you spread it over a few days, you'd probably be able to, do a fair amount.
Okay. And students would have access to the same platform as
They
well.
won't need it, because what it does is it's basically creating an interactive program in JavaScript or in Python or something else that will be embedded as a link right within the LMS. So they would click on it and it would add interactivity of the same sort that many publisher applications
I
provide.
see. Okay. And the second question I had was, if you say, you take maybe you take an image from somewhere else or something and embed it into this course material that you're creating. There are the usual copyright
Yes,
issues.
because anything that you create has to be able to be released under Creative Commons license, which means you can use public domain images, or you can use images that you create, or government documents that, because they are released to the public domain, or you could use AI to generate them with appropriate citation. So,
Okay.
but yeah, you
Thank
wouldn't be able to embed images that you took from elsewhere.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And the last option is active learning activities in a tilt format, and it's not really created. Well, it's sort of created in Gemini. You could ask Gemini to create an active learning activity. This would be primarily for in-person classes, but it could work, I suppose, for online classes, where you just ask it to generate something and to put it in a tilt framework. And the tilt framework involves Marianne Winklemas's transparency in learning and teaching, where it will, for every assignment, it has 3 components. The first is the purpose of the assignment, why you're asking students to do it. The next is a description of it. And the last part is how they're going to be evaluated. So it's basically just making it clear to students why we're asking them to do certain things. So they don't feel like they're just jumping through hoops, that it ties to the learning objectives in the course and so forth. So, and I've already generated some GPTs and some gems that will help do that if you're not comfortable with it, where you just give it, you can give an assignment that you had used in the past, upload that along with your syllabus or the learning objectives for the module, and it will automatically create that. And it will also generate a rubric for you if you'd like, if it's something, you know, where that would be helpful. So you don't have to do all these things, but, you know, basically the goal is to embed AI in at least 3 of these ways. You're welcome to do all of them, and you're welcome to do it. You know, you could do like a Socratic tutorial that works for the whole semester. And we had people who attended the workshop did that within an hour. So it's not that hard to do, and you can always tweak it by going back and revising a little bit. And the vibe coding, I was amazed at how easy that is. And if it doesn't work, you just tell it to make some changes. So you're essentially having it do all the programming for you, and it creates a file that you just upload to typically to GitHub, and then you store it there in a
Typically to what?
GitHub, which is Microsoft, I believe, owns it, but they allow free storage up to a certain amount. And it's basically where you can store the program. And the nice thing about that is once you create any vibe coded applications, you could embed them in as many classes as you want, because there may be some things that might be used in multiple classes. And then you just basically take the embed code, pop it into the material, and it's there.
But isn't each code for each assignment different?
Yes, but if you're using, well, the vibe coded thing is a program, and the program could do many different things. For example, I think I mentioned in about 2 minutes, I created a demand and supply interactive diagram, but that could pretty easily be embedded in multiple courses that use demand and supply or that review it, for example.
But if I wanted it to demonstrate disparate impact, I would have to create a different code, wouldn't I? Well, I'm
It's
gonna,
a question of how, would that be something you do with a program, or would it be a specific case? If it's done with a program, it could be something where you're randomizing some things, like the proportion of people in different categories and the areas, and then have it come up with random numbers for each assignment. And that could be a vibe coded application. But the problem with that is I don't think it would be very easy to integrate that to the grade book if you wanted it to be a graded assignment. If you want to do that with random numbers, you'd be better off doing it right in Brightspace with the algorithmic questions, where you can have it vary the parameters in that, I think. Okay, so any questions on any of these activities? Do they all seem reasonable?
After we have the workshop.
But yeah, there will be workshops on each and every one of these. Okay, and in fact, we still have a notebook. We talked about notebook element 3 or 4 workshops already, but we have one coming up later this week. And there's one on active learning later today, but the tilt form. Is there another one on tilt? There might be another one coming up on tilt too, but we'll certainly do this for everyone in the group, and we'll make it open to all faculty too, because these are all nice to know. But the vibe coding is just the quality of the programming and the quality of the applications automatically developed has improved so dramatically in the last 6 months to a year. It's really amazing. Okay, so okay, this is what happens when you have something generated by the last screen I put together. This duplicates a little bit of it. So these are some of the strategies that would be built in, and they're pretty much the same sort of thing in a different form. But you could also use one thing that was not included in that list, but is part of the development project, is you could also use AI to generate, revise, and verify any ancillaries you include for accessibility and alignment with course objectives. So I should have combined those 2 slides, but this was done kind of late at night. Okay, so some of the things we'd like to see built into this is that the courses be built with evidence-based teaching materials, giving students feedback, space practice, retrieval practice, having them engage in some reflection on their learning. One of the problems now is with AI, it's really easy to generate reasonably high quality educational products. Pretty much any assignment we could give students, AI can do a pretty good job of replicating that. But it can't replicate as easily, well, it can, but not as easily, some of the metacognitive reflection where students reflect on the process. What we have to do is come up with more ways of evaluating the process of learning rather than just the product of learning. Because, what we really wanted to know is how much students have learned and how well they've learned, and et cetera. But we used to be able to do that by just looking at what they created. What they created and submit is no longer really a very good measure of what they've learned, given the availability of AI tools. We also want to create multimodal materials, and that's where things like those podcasts would be handy, just giving students another way of seeing the material. You could also link to YouTube videos, and in most disciplines, there's all sorts of, there's probably thousands for pretty much nearly any discipline out there of AI, YouTube videos on components of the course, at least. We want to use AI in the process of creating to make sure that everything's accessible, but also that we've built an inclusive environment. So, we had some workshops on that last Tuesday, I think it was, on using AI to check the syllabus for inclusive language and making some recommendations to help create a sense of belonging and so forth. And we also want students to move from just being consumers of AI to actually more critically evaluating the output of AI. And how you do that in a discipline will vary from discipline to discipline. For example, one thing that's been really common in writing classes, which is where this has hit really hard, well, it's hit hard everywhere, but is the pair approach, which is a combination of having students write something, have them submit it to AI to get some feedback, having them submit the same thing to their peers and getting some feedback from their peers, and then reflecting on the different outputs they received. In what ways was the suggestions from AI better or worse than the suggestions from their peers? And then they submit a final project that incorporates all of that. And typically what students are asked to do is to submit their original submission, to submit the feedback they received at each stage, and then submit the final product so that the instructor can see how it's transformed as it's moved through the process. But we are going to have to do more work on evaluating how students are completing the work. And if we really want it to be a measure of how students are learning. This is the usual sort of thing, accessibility. We want it to be everything meets the requirements, which again, legally it will be required to do by late April of next year anyway. We dodged the bullet this year, but we want it to be there. And the other thing is when we create this, our own materials or use OER materials, it's there when students log in, because otherwise students who can't afford their textbooks end up getting left behind. And I've seen students sometimes wait 3 or 4 weeks to buy their books. And the students who wait the longest are generally the students who are most at risk anyway. So we don't want to put the students who are most at risk further at risk. So this is a timeline. Summer, fall, spring, and then everything would be done by June 30th. We have to submit a final report indicating that everyone has done this. We'll probably have to set a deadline in late May or early June just to get the funds into people's paychecks, because it has to be done within the budget year. And I think we generally have to do that sometime in May just to make sure, because otherwise, I'm not sure if it's harder to extend things from one budget year to the other, especially with a transfer of funds from the SUNY system to the campus. And what we were talking about is having mandatory monthly check-in meetings, and we picked multiple times to make sure that everyone could attend them. And again, there's going to be workshops on all these things, and we're going to be here to work with you. And we do have, working in the group, This was a joint proposal from the library, and Nicole Westedall is going to be working on that from the library side. She's our local campus OER representative for the SUNY system, and she's done quite a bit with OER. We'd encourage people to engage in SOTL work, to evaluate, to test how this is working, to do some comparisons of how this might have worked compared to earlier approaches that they've used. And once we're done, we'd like to share all this. We'd certainly encourage everyone to present on this during the 2027 spring breakout sessions, or if we do another AI symposium during that, to talk about how AI was used to help create the courses or to add additional components to it. And so this is the team that evaluated the proposal, although I ended up doing all the writing because we decided to do it the day before it was due, and it was submitted a good 2 hours before the midnight deadline. So, but we also, what we like to have is at least a couple people attend SUNY IT. It's going to, SUNY CIT. It's going to be in SUNY IT, which is why I fumbled on that, which is in Utica. So, anyone could go, but we have $1,000 allocated for travel for a couple of people. So travel and the fee for attending, the registration fee. We didn't want to put too much on the registration on the CIT funding because we'd rather see more people engaged in this. But we'd like to get everyone involved, and we'd probably do a podcast on it, just describing the process at the end, and have some of the people, whoever wants to, would be able to talk about what they did and how it worked and so forth. And those are the major things, I think. So, and one of the things we had to include was the estimated impact. Based on the people who expressed an interest when we did the initial survey, we noted that this was not, it was very tentative, but we had people we looked at the number of students who were potentially affected, and there were 1,055 students from the 12 or 13 people who had expressed an interest in it, and using $100 as a typical cost fee, typical textbook cost, given that a lot of them are already electronic, that was a projected benefit. So, that was part of the rate of return criteria that was put into the grant, because that's required for OER grants. So, the SUNY system would be getting a pretty good return on this investment. And there we go. So, so who should apply? Faculty, people who are eager to adopt or expand OER use, people wanting to rethink materials with accessibility in mind. Again, this was AI generated, but accessibility in mind should be in all of our courses anyway now. People who want to experiment with generative AI tools, and people who want to create something that's sustainable and shareable, again, should be encouraged to do this. And it should be fun. It's going to be work, but so questions.
Well, the first one is, what do you need from us and by when?
Okay, one thing I did share in the email, and it'll be up on the screen in just a minute, is a commitment to participate in this. And we'll take the first 14 people who agree to do this, and I suspect we'll probably be encouraging more people later this summer, so there's no immediate rush on this, but the sooner the better. We're hoping to have the full cohort there by the time we start in the fall. So you don't have to decide now, but think about it.
Hey, we decide now, section, I think I'd like to.
Deciding now would be better in that I wouldn't have to worry about filling out the cohort.
I'd like to do it.
Okay, so to do that, fill out this project interest form. It's just a simple, I think it just asks the same sort of information we asked before. Are you interested are you willing to do this? And what courses would you work with? And I think it may have asked, I don't think this even asked the number of students. It may have, but
It did, the first one, it did.
the first one, but I'm not sure it did. It may have.
Sorry,
So
John, the link is not.
let me put that in chat. And I will share the slides too.
So, yeah, because I don't have my phone and
Yeah, let me, there we go. So I'm going to put this right in chat. Oh, and Isabel asked, okay, there were a couple questions in chat that I didn't notice. Okay, let's go back there. The form is now in chat. So let's see. There were some questions about oh yeah, okay. Peter had some good suggestions. One was it's helpful in creating populated brightspace shells, just loading your syllabus in an empty brightspace course export package, and it will populate your shell with this. Now, is that Gemini or was that something else, Peter?
I've only ever done it with Claude, but it worked very well to get just like the basics in there. Not like I developed my own content after that, but just to get the like the logistical elements like due dates and assignments and rubrics all loaded into Brightspace. It'll do it all. It pulls it from the syllabus and it translates it into Brightspace equivalent, and it'll work in the course.
Excellent. So yeah, that would be a really good way of getting the basic structure out, and then you can tweak it. It could be the textbook audio podcast summaries. It doesn't have to be the textbook, but again, you could do. I would suggest if you're going to use NotebookLM to generate podcasts, I would probably do that for each course module, and it could be tied to the textbook. It could be tied to online materials that you share. NotebookLM and the accounts that we have, the free accounts that SUNY Oswego provides, will allow up to 50 sources in any notebook. So I would suggest creating a notebook for each module, which could correspond to a chapter in a textbook if it's a traditional OER text that you're using. Upload that chapter to it and then add any other material. So you could add information, you could have it search for materials, and I think it will add up to 10 from a search where you can select those. Or you could link to if there's YouTube videos that are public with a transcript, you can also add those to the training database, to the resources for a notebook. You could add websites to it if there are websites that are appropriate, and it will generate an audio summary. You can adjust its length within some reasonable amount, but by default, it's usually 12 to 18 minutes or so. And it's just a nice, succinct, informal summary with two speakers, a male and female speaker, and they will alternate. And if you haven't listened to any of those audio podcasts created in NotebookLM, they really are impressive. You'll hear the breathing of the simulated voices. You'll hear, the filler words, the ums, the you knows, and those sorts of things. So they do a fairly good job of creating synthesized voices. And if you're on social media a lot, you see a lot of videos and other things that were created using NotebookLM. And let's see, other questions.
John, is this a new response form or something that we?
This is one that I shared about 2 weeks ago, a week or so ago.
Yeah.
We had done one back in February when the grants were due, just to see if there was any interest. But I wanted to get a new one just because I'm not sure how many of the people, who expressed interest then still wanted to do it. And a couple of people said they're not interested now.
I also have a few questions.
Sure.
So one of my question is, I do use right now, let's say a textbook that the students have to pay for, but they are out there, free textbooks that they require no author's rights any longer. The problem is that those do not come with a lab book practice, a practice lab book, and do not come with audios, and those have to be created. So to me, is this project only if you create from scratch the entire thing?
No, you would start with typically OER textbooks that are already out there.
Okay.
So it would be mostly to solve exactly that issue.
That issue.
So that what you would be adding are the types of things that the publisher adders
Yeah.
for labs and et cetera. And, you know, there's certainly some fairly decent translation labs you can use and other things that you could embed in there.
And my other question was, I remember there was a question in, maybe in the forum you posted, which was how many students you will have. And, you know, in obviously in the general education courses, you have more students. But some of this sounds quite interesting because I make, you know, lots of copies and I give to my students lots of materials, you know, on Brightspace, in hand. So I go well beyond textbooks in upper level courses, you know. So I'm wondering,
Anything that you do here, you could also add to other courses.
well, you know, in languages you cannot do that because whatever you create in a 101, 102, you don't have in a 200, you don't have in a 300, you don't have in a 400. It's a difference in language.
Right, okay, in
You
the
know.
level, yeah.
Yes. So, for instance, if I create something at the 300 level, maybe sometimes I could, if I do, I don't know, let's say 302 and a 310, maybe the 310, I can see useful to go and take something and review from 302. So I'm wondering, can you use this for lower enrolled courses or you
Yeah,
have
there's
to
no
use
restriction. That was just, the reason for the initial question was because we had to list how many students potentially might be affected. So that was, you know, I don't think we're going to have that many people interested that we really have to worry about making cuts. I mean, if it was a choice between a 500 a class with 500 students and a class with 5 students, we would give priority to the 500 student class just because of the impact. But I don't think that's going to be an issue.
Okay.
You know, that
And
I would be very surprised if we ended up with more than 14 people interested.
And my very last one,
Mhm.
can cheating be avoided? Because, like, for instance, I say, okay, guys, we study comparisons. I want you to write a composition in which you compare traditional marriage with modern marriage. And you have to do this in your composition. So I make sure they get all comparison degrees. And if they take those instructions and put them in ChatGPT, they are getting their composition.
They are, and
So
that's
how
where,
do we
and
avoid
that's an
it?
issue with all of our classes. And it's challenging. We've had a couple workshops on that already. I think
okay.
Peter had talked about that. And there's another one coming up on Thursday. It's an issue we're all facing in our classes. And I think the general approach is to focus more on observing the process, which could involve having, I mean, one solution people are using is having oral exams where you talk to the students. You know, another thing is you have students, let students use AI, but share their interactions with you so that you can see what they did, what they asked it, and how they modified the response based on what they did. But there are no foolproof, without proctored exams, there are really no foolproof ways of avoiding AI. You know, what the main thing we can do is remind students that, you know, there are always shortcuts available. You know, an analogy people often use is saying, you know, if you go to a gym, you could, you know, put a machine in that would lift weights or that would make the treadmill run, but you're not actually benefiting from that, you know, and just regularly reminding students that it is important that they develop some skills if their degree is going to be valuable once they leave here. So, you know, the more we can shift the focus to skill development and less away from grades, the better. And another approach that some people have been using involves alternative grading, where students are in one extreme, an ungrading method where students focus entirely on their learning and they reflect on that and they submit reflections, and there is some observable product where essentially they recommend a grade to you based on a rubric you share with them or a form you share with them. And then you meet with the students individually and you come to an agreement based on your observation of what they've done and their own perceptions of that. But it's, it's metacognitive reflections can be simulated very nicely using AI. We really have to remind students though that if they are going to be paid more than, say, a high school graduate, they have to be able to do more than just write prompts. They have to be able to critically evaluate that. They need to develop the automaticity that's needed within a discipline. They need the basic skills to be successful. And it's something we do need to remind students of. And it's not going to work for all students. Some students have always cheated, but we want to, the more we can shift the focus away from a focus on grades, the better off we are. And it's hard because students from the time they were in second or third grade were told that their success is determined by the grades they get. And now it's really easy to get good grades without necessarily learning that much.
It doesn't work out, John. When I was at University of Michigan, the professor in one of our courses gave an A- to the lowest, kind of results in the class. In other words, you couldn't get any lower than an A-. Guess what the result was? Most of students would come unprepared every single day. That was the result. It doesn't matter, even if you take, the grade, the issue of the grade out.
Well, but what some people have done is they've used some type of contract grading where there's certain minimum things students have to do. For face-to-face classes, more and more work is being shifted to the classroom where the instructor is there and can observe it. The formative assessments and practice goes outside of the class. But it doesn't have to be an A- minimum. You can set up standards. There's a lot of approaches, and actually there's a session on that.
I just give an example, because these are doctoral students,
It's
even with doctoral students.
specifications grading is another thing where we put in well-defined things and let students demonstrate their learning, with minimum standards. But that's a much broader topic. Basically, the main purpose of this is to create materials that will allow us to basically reduce the barrier of cost to students in our classes. And you also have more control over the material because you'll be selecting that material. And when you're working with OER text or Creative Commons work and so forth, you can rewrite them, you can modify them and so forth, as long as you provide credit to the original authors. So,
John, a question, sorry. Granted, things have changed, but a couple of years ago, maybe, I don't know exactly when, I asked Nicole to find me an OER text, and she was not able to really find one. So related to this,
okay, there's a few places to look, and we'll share more materials on it, but
what happens if I can't find a suitable OER text?
well, I was wondering the same thing, because one thing you could always do is if we go to, I think it's oer.suny.edu, yeah, and then we go to courses. This is a good place to look. We can accept the cookies. And these are courses that are already packaged out there. But another good place is OpenStax at Rice University. Well, let's just put in OpenStax because I don't remember exactly where it is. Here we go, openstax.org. And they've got a lot of textbooks out there, and there's a number of others. If you go to the higher education one, what course is it?
Human resource management.
Okay, well, let's see what we've got. So if we go here, is there a search? Well, there's business, but let's see. Well, another way of doing it when all else fails is put in human resource management, OER, and let's just see what comes up.
So there are.
Here we go. Here's some resources, because there are more coming up all the time. Well, here's one: unrestricted use, CC BY, with just giving them credit. You may not be exactly what you want, and here's another one, but you can mix and match these things and use them however you'd like. and just
You
embed them.
You can like use different parts of different text to and
Yes.
sort of create your own text.
You could pick chapters or portions and
That's what I mean.
recombine them. You just need to provide at the end of each chapter, a credit to the original creators.
Right.
So there are some now, because there's a lot of institutions have been giving grants for the development of these things. So, and we will share some resources, but a good place to start is just searching OER and then the course name. And, it doesn't, what I'm not so sure about, and when you mention this, if there is no textbook out there, I mean, you could conceivably use a large language model to help develop a textbook where the chapters would be written by that, as long as you go through and edit it yourself. Citations, now there are methods of citing the materials and so on. It would be better if you went through one of the OER things, because most of them have been peer reviewed in some way. And, but if you're willing to do all the editing yourself, you could do that. But it's more work. If you can already find one, it's a whole lot easier. And if it's a PDF, you could just, if it's a PDF with 15 chapters, you could just print the pages for a chapter as a new PDF and then upload that to one module if you want to arrange it by that. If you want to create a new one, you could take sections from each and recombine them. Any other questions from anyone online or here? I think it's kind of exciting. I'm looking forward to this.
So this survey that the link that
Oh,
you
yes.
sent was like May 30th. I just checked.
Did I say that?
No, you said that.
Oh, that's when I sent it out. Yeah.
A week ago, I just checked. It's this one, right? You send a kind of individual.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Because I sent it out to everyone who was in the original thing. Yes.
Yeah.
And then one that went out to all faculty.
Okay.
So, yeah, so if you fill this out,
Yeah.
it would, and I did put the link in chat. And the other thing is, one other thing, so that everyone has access. Oh, here we go.
It's not in the chat.
It was not in the chat. Okay, let me go back and do that again. Because I did copy the URL.
I have it. I can drop it in the
put it
chat.
now if you want.
Oh, you know what I did? I think it was it went to one person and not to everyone, because I didn't notice it had switched. There we go. So now it is in the chat. So yeah, Isabel had asked which courses to choose, how long level, whatever courses you'd like to develop this for. It would be nice if it would be, it would impact more students. But, there's a lot of areas where we're not using OER, and community colleges have done really well with spreading the use of OER. Four-year colleges, not so much. And it can make a big difference in terms of student success, just getting that first day access.
If I can ask another follow-up question.
Sure.
Just to be clear, we don't have to create a whole course. We can just create the ancillary material. That's what the OER is about, is sharing the ancillary material for an OER textbook. Is that correct? Or
Basically, the goal would be to create the whole course, but you don't have to create the OER textbook. It would be good, though, if you either embedded it or linked to the readings. So basically, it would be like any other course where students would go in and they would have the readings right there.
okay.
But you don't have to write them. If you can find a good OER, just adopt that and embed it. And it could be embedded as PDFs as long as they're accessible, or it could be converted into a more accessible format, or you could link to it, etc. And Michael had asked about filling out the form again. This is a different form than the one in February. So because I wasn't sure how many people would want to continue through, and I figured this was an easier way to start fresh now that we knew we had the grant and a little bit more about it.
By when do we have to give you an answer?
Within the first 14 people to submit.
Okay.
So, unless we can dig up some money on campus, and I know in the past, we were lucky with the IATG grants to be able to get some additional funding. But pretty much all campus budgets have been cut quite a bit. CTS had done some additional funding in the past, but there's just not so much money now, right now.
Yes, of
So,
course.
because their budget was cut pretty drastically, as have all budgets on campus with, the general budget issues. Unless we get a lot more students, or if we can keep more of our students, we won't have to worry as much about that. And this is one way to help keep more students.
Or you could vote down the contract and they wouldn't have to pay for the raises and then.
There is that, but I wouldn't recommend that approach.
Thank you so much. I have a 2 o'clock thing coming.
Okay, and yeah, we do have one in here too.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Any chance you could send me that link if I didn't have my phone?
Oh, yeah, yeah, let me, I will do that right now.
This sounds interesting. I'm not. Because I'm confident how well I'll be able to do it, but I think I'm gonna sign up.
I don't think it's gonna be that hard, and I think it could be fun. I think. And let me stop the recording though.